This video is shot in hybrid log gamma and edited in high dynamic range. How does it look? Hopefully you're watching this on an HDR display, but even if you're not, hybrid log gamma is technically backwards compatible to standard dynamic range, meaning if you're watching this on any other display that's non-HDR, it should look okay. Anyways, in this video, I want to share with you guys how I am prepared to shoot HDR content and share with you guys what I've learned on how to transform HLG into HDR. Now, this is completely different from how we talked about HLG before, in which we strictly color graded it for Rec. 709 standard displays. However, viewing HDR content has become a lot more common now. We can actually use HLG for its intended purpose. 4K televisions have been able to display HDR content for a few years now, but a majority of YouTube consumption actually comes from smartphones, especially the newer iPhones. Those are capable of displaying HDR. And HDR is so magical, right? It's much more than just brighter and more vibrant, punchier video colors. It's a grander viewing experience. However, creating HDR videos can be very daunting, which is why I want to create this video to steer you in the right direction. So think of this more as a starter guide in terms of getting the necessary equipment and getting your first HDR video onto YouTube. For more in-depth HDR resources, I'll link some of my favorite guides and YouTube channel in the description box below. By the way, a huge shout outs to Virtual Japan. He's been kind enough to answer all of my questions about HDR and making sure that I set up my workflow correctly. He does a lot of virtual walks around Japan in HDR, so definitely check out his YouTube channel. And if you sorely miss Japan like I do, it's incredibly therapeutic to throw one of his videos in the background. So I'm gonna go ahead and go over the gear that I have as well as what's recommended for HDR grading. And you're gonna need a camera that can do 10-bit log recording. Obviously, I have the Sony A1, the a7S III, both are capable of 10-bit hybrid log gamma. And technically, you can do HDR with S-Log, but in this video, we're just gonna focus on HLG. Now, while 10-bit is preferred, you can kind of get away with using 8-bit cameras like the a7III or the a6400. It's just that it's not preferred. And number two, you're gonna need an editing software that supports HDR grading with a wider gamut color space. So pretty much the big three: Adobe Premiere Pro, Final Cut Pro 10, or Davinci Resolve. Now, for me, I actually bought Resolve because it has some of the best color and luminance control, and you'll see why later. And although we are focusing more on Resolve in this video, I'll go ahead and link in the description box below how to set up an HDR workflow for Premiere Pro and Final Cut Pro 10. And number three, you need an input-output box that bypasses the graphics card of your computer to accurately send HDR signal to your reference monitor. And obviously, number four, you need an HDR reference monitor. And sitting behind me right here is the Asus ProArt PA32UCX-PK, and they are the sponsor of this video. But whether or not you choose the ProArt, it is vital to have an HDR reference monitor, which we'll go over why and how the ProArt is ready for HDR grading. Now, in terms of camera settings, obviously you want to change your picture profile to the ones that have HLG, but you got to make sure that your color mode is in BT 2020. Now, you might have noticed there's 4 different HLG. HLG by itself is just a standard, but there's also HLG 1 to 3, and those offer a balance between dynamic range and noise reduction. So HLG 1 has a smaller dynamic range, but handles noise a lot better. So you might want to consider that if you're shooting at night or in low light situations. Whereas HLG 3 has a wider dynamic range, but not so good of a noise control, so you might want to use that during the day. HLG 2 offers a balance between dynamic range and noise reduction, so I would consider using that if it's going to be your first time shooting with HLG. So earlier I mentioned that you need this input-output device, and when I first got started with the whole HDR workflow, I kept asking, is this thing important? And HDR Pro says yes, and that's because your graphics card cannot reliably send HDR signals directly to your reference monitor. You need to have this input-output device for your editing software to talk directly to your HDR reference monitor. Now, there are 2 that are recommended by the internet, and they're both by Blackmagic, one of which is the UltraStudio 3G recorder, which is pretty affordable at $115, but the output is limited to 1080p 60. The one that I have is the UltraStudio 4K Mini. Obviously, it can't output to 4K, however, it costs $995. Now, there are some deck links in between those price ranges, but some assembly is required, but they pretty much do the same thing. So if you're just experimenting, you want to see if HDR Workflow is right for you, I would probably start with a 3G recorder first. So after you got your I/O box hooked up, you're going to need to download and install the Blackmagic desktop video setup, open it, and configure the resolution and frame rate that you'll be working in. If you're a Final Cut Pro 10 user, you can just scroll down to find the settings that you need to change. And for color gamut, make sure to put Rec 2020 HLG if you're working with HLG footage. Next, open up Resolve and go to Preference. And under the Video and Audio I/O tab, make sure the capture and monitor device is set to your UltraStudio. Next, go to File, Project Settings, and change your timeline resolution and frame rate to what you're working in. Under the Video Monitoring section, change it to your output. For me, it's going to be UHD 2160 23.976. Make sure data level is set to video bit depth to 10-bit, and enable HDR metadata over HDMI. Next, go to your color management tab, change this to Davinci YRGB Color Manage, and this to Davinci Wide Gamut. Then, change your output color space to Rec 2100 HLG. Enable Display HDR on viewers if available, and we're going to be mastering for 1000 nits. Then the last thing we want to make sure is go to your color tab, and make sure your scopes is set to HDR ST2084 HLG. And now you are ready to begin color grading, assuming of course you have an HDR reference monitor. You actually can't rely on your edit screen right here to start color grading because this is not a true representation of what your final video would look like. So this is where the Asus ProArt display comes in handy. So thank you Asus for sponsoring this video and finally letting me experience what true HDR workflow is like. And while this is an advertisement spot, I do want to show you guys why it's important to have an HDR reference monitor. This baby right here, this is the ProArt PA32UCX-PK, and this is the world's first 32-inch 4K HDR monitor featuring mini LED backlighting with 1200 nits of peak brightness. And that just means this thing is crazy bright, and you want to be mastering HDR content at least 1000 nits. Now just to give you an idea, my iMac 2020 Retina 5K display has a max brightness of 500 nits, and that's really only enough to view HDR content comfortably, but not confidently grade in HDR just because of how limited the dynamic range is. Simply raising the brightness on this monitor will already make the shadows and darker areas of the footage glowy, grayed, and washed out. But with a proper reference monitor, it is capable of pushing the areas that are supposedly bright at the correct luminance level while keeping the supposed area in the shadows nice and dark like it's intended. It's not raising the entire screen brightness, it's dynamically changing its luminance level based on the zones. With the ProArt, this is accomplished through mini LED backlighting technology, which uses a technique called loco dimming, and it has 1152 of those zones, so pretty wide coverage. And this is where it's also important to have ease of use color and lighting control of Resolve, because you can really separate the multiple tiers of whites and blacks while you're grading. Now, whenever we talk about color grading, having a color accurate monitor is essential. The ProArt features true 10-bit color with quantum dot technology. So even if you're not doing exclusively HDR content, it's a great color display for sRGB, Adobe RGB, and even DCI P3. So it's a pretty well-rounded monitor. Now out of the box, it's already color calibrated, although it's recommended that you calibrate your monitor every couple of months. And it does come with a calibration technology which offers color accuracy tuning, and it actually saves that calibrated profile onto the monitor itself so it stays consistent in case you need to plug it into a different setup. But we're talking about HDR here, so you already know this is capable of HLG viewing, but in case you are shooting in a different HDR format like PQ, the monitor does have HDR PQ DCI or HDR PQ Rec 2020. Now, because we are using the Blackmagic output box, if we got our settings right, it should send that HDMI metadata over to the monitor, and the monitor will automatically switch to that color viewing display automatically. In addition to that, it supports HDR10 and Dolby Vision in case you're advanced enough to work on these formats, or you simply want to enjoy content that are made in these formats, so like video games and Netflix. By the way, if you're still confused with the whole HDR jargon like HDR10+, Dolby Vision, BT2100 Rec 2020, I highly recommend checking out this HDR Explain video by ZY Productions. He broke it down so simply that even I, someone who's super technologically challenged, can understand. On top of that, you can actually hook this up as a secondary display to your computer without the output box. Just use it as a secondary screen via HDMI, DisplayPort, and Thunderbolt 3. It's really nice for that too. I am truly impressed with this as someone who does a lot of video work. It's giving me such a better perspective when it comes to working with HDR, because you can't really make the guesswork on the curves and hope for the best. Being able to see every little details that you are adjusting on the ProArt display makes all the difference. So check out the Asus ProArt PA32UCX-PK. I'll have all the literature's link in the description box below. Now it's time to export. Now, this is incredibly easy. We're gonna export this into H.265. It's a much smaller and manageable file format while retaining all that high quality goodness. And it will be particularly useful if you start uploading 20+ minute long HDR videos. So come to your delivery tab here. You can also export this in ProRes, but for this video, we're gonna export H.265. Make sure to set your format to QuickTime, codec H.265, and enable use hardware acceleration if possible. This is gonna speed up your export process by a lot. Come down to encoding profile and select main 10. And just in case, come down to advanced setting and make sure the color space tag and gamma tag is set to same as project. This is something that we've already set earlier during our timeline setup, but just in case, you can also come down and select Rec 2020 and gamma tag to Rec 2100 HLG. And finally, export this sucker and upload it to YouTube. Now, after uploading, even though YouTube finishes processing the 4K version of your file, it could still take a bit before the HDR badge shows up on the cogwheel of the player. So if timing your release is important, you want to take that into consideration that it could take another few hours before your video is technically HDR ready. Let me know what you guys think of this whole HDR process. Daunting or exciting? Now personally for me, it was a huge struggle for me to learn everything and finally getting it right. But hopefully I was able to speed up a lot of that process for you in case you're interested in getting to HDR yourself. Now, don't expect every single one of my future videos to be in HDR, but I am excited to produce some travel HDR content, so subscribe and stay tuned for those. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.